It's not you, of course, right? It's the bank that gave you that card. So we have two different sides of the equation. One, the banks that are giving you these cards, right, that are paying for all the data compromises that are occurring completely out of their control, right? And so what they can do is they can try to apply for reimbursement of those funds, but they're really not getting it. So it'd be like if you were sitting at home and your neighbor decided they don't want to take care of their house and yours collapsed, right? Why are we sitting here doing this? So the entire PCI standard, as it was developed, was really put in place to develop a baseline of security controls for a broad spectrum of the industry to help protect against this type of stuff. So if we think about how we got to where we are today, let's just extrapolate it out a little bit further. When we think about regulatory compliance from the bigger picture perspective, right, it really goes well beyond anything information security related. We've seen this for a long time in coming. In fact, if we look back to 1906 with the Food and Drug Administration, that was an act of regulatory compliance to a degree, right? In 1934, the SEC was formed, immediately after the Great Depression, right? When we're looking at this perspective, it's important to remember that we see this continuous rise and fall. So regulatory compliance is constantly trying to address regulation, deregulation, regulation, deregulation. So where we're at right now is a situation where there's a culmination of fraud that was occurring, and the industry got together proactively, interestingly enough, to try to address the type of fraud. Now, ultimately, I believe that we all agree on where we're trying to get. Right? We all agree on the same goal. We talk about security. How we define that is a little bit of the conversation today. I'll turn it back over to Jack before I make any further points.
So why don't we give Anton a few moments to talk about some of his perspective and background, and then we can start being schmooball targets again.
Okay, I think it's time to crank up the volume. Thanks, Mike, for the background, but I think I want to start arguing with Josh. That's more fun. When I do that, there's just like sparks flying and all that. So there are many things good and bad about PCI, as Jack said, and there are some things that Josh likes to highlight, which are very, very intelligent, and they're also correct. At the same time, the focus of PCI was to drag people who are completely ignorant and negligent to a level of slightly smaller degree of ignorance and negligence. I mean, apart from what the Mike said about the cost transfers and all that, and I've seen PCI do that. And in fact, I've seen people who completely ignored viruses in the 90s, they ignored worms in the 2000s, they ignored everything else, and suddenly PCI came and they're like, oh, what's an IP address? We got to learn that. And so, to me, that's the main thing that I call the magic of PCI, is that it dragged some people who were in complete backwoods into the, well, I don't know, is there a term, front woods? Well, they're still in the woods, but they're sort of like closer to the light. And yes, at the same time, it made lives of some fairly intelligent people a little bit hard. And I think that's not good, for sure. I mean, if people have to change the good way of doing security that they have already to a slightly more PCI-inclined way, that's a cost on them. And these people totally do not deserve it. However, it's my belief that that cost we can tolerate, because it has literally dragged people such as store chains, I don't know, almost all the way down to gas station owners that, wait, maybe that pump shouldn't have a flat file dump of all the cards swiped for the last 3 years. Real story. Maybe we should finally remove those card dumps from the website. I don't remember who told me the story, one of the QSA friends, that a company was kind of like on the defensive because a QSA pointed out that storing big ASCII files with numbers on the website is just not a good idea. And they're like, you think? Oh, so we should like do something about it? Yeah. So for them, it was a deep insight that it's not a good idea. So these people are absolutely impacted of PCI. They're suffering, and that's a good thing. Hopefully, they will learn something. Now, sometimes Josh doesn't really do this, but some other people who criticize PCI say that PCI made those people only do PCI. It made them very laser focused on the checkboxes. What's the minimum possible we can do to make that QSA leave, if not happy, but kind of like satisfied? Or what can we do to basically make PCI go away? And yes, that's certainly a real phenomenon. And there are people who would say, well, code review or web firewall? Code review is some kind of a big esoteric area. Firewall is this box we can drag over there, screw it in the rack, and we're done. So that type of thinking is clearly
Don't make fun of firewalls.
However, as I wrote in one of the blog posts, I think PCI isn't a cure for stupidity, and I don't think there is a cure for stupidity, kind of off the record. So if somebody would be stupid with PCI, he would probably be equally, well, not smart without PCI either. Now, from the other points, there's one point that Josh highlights that I really like, and I think that point is actually quite dangerous. And let me go and argue for the other side for a second. So, as you know, I've worked at vendors for quite some time. And so if you work at a vendor and you have 10 engineers, and you can have those 10 engineers research recent bad stuff, or you'd have 7 engineers research the bad stuff, and 3 engineers would be writing compliance reports. Now, technically, you will have something similar to a 30% drop in your loosely defined overall efficiency. Now, that's a real phenomenon, I think. And I've seen it happen, and at the time when I've seen it happen, I didn't think of it as particularly bad. But Josh kind of grabbed me by the ears and said, see, that's bad. And that's going all over the industry. So that part, I don't have a counter-argument for. I still think the overall raising people out of ignorance, sort of like balances this out, but that's still there. Question?
I keep being blown away by this because I was on the other side of being a So PCI attempts or endeavors to do is ask 1 million people to figure out the right way to do it instead of fixing the system at the center and making everything non-optional.
Yeah.
Thou shalt, and it only works this way, putting a real-time transactional system in place of a system that was designed in the 40s and 50s to support end up buying pretty good. And what we need to do is stop trying to tell a million people to puzzle it out and create a business model behind, hey, y'all figure out the best way to make the good stuff happen, and instead just make the good stuff happen, not optional.
Paid by?
You know,
Yeah.
Yeah, so, you know, this is, of course, the age-old, why are we still using the magnetic stripe type of, you know, question that exists. Quite frankly, the reason we're using the magnetic stripe is because all of you like things that are cheap, and you don't like to pay more, which is going to be, there's a huge cost associated with upgrading all of the different payment terminals. But let's just move beyond that for a minute, because I think that there was, sorry, not to move beyond that, but you know, there's a couple things we have to remember that exist within this industry that are unique rather than others, right? With other industries, or at least specifically potentially with the rest of security, you never really have to worry about your neighbor, right? All you have to worry about is yourself, theoretically. You think, all I need to do is secure my organization and I'll be perfectly fine. And one of the problems that we see here is that when we talk about telling X million, you know, organizations, and there's well over 4.8 million merchants in the United States alone, when you talk about telling one organization to be secure, it's important because what happens with credit card data is that if you decide you are not going to be secure, you're going to disclose that information, what happens is that credit card data gets used at another merchant. Items are purchased, they lose that money. They have lost the goods, now they've lost the money, they may not get reimbursed for it. So your insecurity causes harm to another person, which is why we have to address the entire problem as a whole. Now, of course, it goes back to it's too specific. And I've heard this so many times. Tastes great, less filling, right? Too specific, too vague. We can argue this indefinitely. We all agree on the same endpoint. We need to protect the payment card data. However you go about that is entirely up to you. One of Josh's key points is just the no child left behind, right? It's the idea that we are going to pull everyone and make them secure somehow, right? That's not necessarily the case. If your child wants to be smarter, you simply fill out a form and say, we're going to get them to grade X because they're going to test out using these compensating controls or other methods, right? So what we're really talking about, and I think that the industry is becoming the driver, as it always is, ahead of the standard itself, right? We're seeing a lot of new different types of technologies that are being used to remove the data in the first place. Right? So I think when we talk about this, it's important to remember, it's not just us. You can't simply say, well, I'm going to secure myself, and if my neighbor doesn't want to secure themselves, then they don't have to, and they're going to face the repercussions, because they're not. I'm going to.
Question?
Mike, I think for me, though, what you're describing is putting 4.8 million Band-Aids on a sucking chessboard.